The cold was killing her slowly, and she knew it. Kiravel pressed herself deeper into the corner of the broken cargo hold and wrapped her thin arms around her body and tried to hold onto whatever warmth remained inside her, but it was not enough. And it would never be enough, because her kind was not made for places like this. The Volanti came from a world of endless summer where the air was thick and warm and the rivers ran hot from volcanic springs deep beneath the ground, and they had skin like pale glass that glowed with soft blue light from within, and that light meant life and health and hope. But Kiravel watched her own glow fade hour by hour until she could barely see it anymore. 3 days had passed since the attack. She remembered the screams and the explosions, and the way the ship had shuddered when the first missiles struck the hull, and she remembered hiding in a storage container while heavy boots marched past and rough voices shouted orders in the harsh language of the Korvax syndicate, and she remembered the silence that came after when the slavers had taken everyone else and left her behind. They had found her in the container, and one of them had grabbed her arm and looked at her with those cold, yellow eyes, and then he had laughed and thrown her back inside and said something to his companions, and they had all laughed too, because she was small and wounded, and her glow was already dimming, and she was not worth the space she would take on their ship, so they left her on the frozen moon to die alone. The wind screamed through the hole in the hull where the missiles had torn through metal like paper, and ice crystals swirled in the air and settled on her skin and burned like tiny fires wherever they touched, and she could feel her blood slowing in her veins and her thoughts becoming sluggish and confused. In Volanti culture, death was not the worst thing that could happen to a person, because death was simply a door to the Fae, to the next existence, but dying alone and dying unseen and dying without a witness to guide the soul onward was a fate worse than any torment, because it meant wandering forever in the dark between worlds. Kiravel had no witness. She was 17 cycles old, and she had never been away from her homeworld before this journey, and she had been so excited to see the galaxy and meet new species and learn about other cultures, and now she would die on a frozen rock that did not even have a name, and no one would ever know what happened to her. She began to whisper the final rites, and her voice was so weak that she could barely hear herself over the howling wind, but she spoke the ancient words anyway, because they were all she had left, and she asked the spirits of her ancestors to forgive her for dying alone, and she asked them to find her somehow in the endless dark, and she asked them to remember her name, even if no one else ever would. Cold pressed down on her like a heavy blanket, and her eyes began to close, and she thought that perhaps this was not so bad after all, because she could not feel the pain anymore, and she could not feel the fear anymore, and she could only feel a strange, floating sensation like sinking into warm water. She was ready to let go, and then she heard footsteps. Her eyes snapped open, and her heart lurched in her chest, because she knew the sound of Korvac's boots, and she knew they had come back to finish what they started, or worse, to take her after all. And she tried to crawl deeper into the corner, but her body would not obey her commands anymore. The footsteps grew louder, and they crunched through the ice and snow with a heavy, steady rhythm that did not sound like Korvax, because Korvax moved in quick bursts like predators stalking prey. But this sound was different, and this sound was patient and purposeful, and somehow less threatening. Shadow fell across the opening of the cargo. Kiravel looked up and saw a creature she had never seen before, except in stories and warnings and whispered legends that parents told their children to make them behave, because standing in the broken doorway was a human. The human was tall and broad and wrapped in thick layers of thermal gear that made it look even larger, and its breath came out in white clouds that swirled around its head like smoke, and its face was mostly hidden behind a protective mask, but she could see its eyes, and those eyes were not cold and yellow like the Korvax. Those eyes were brown and warm and filled with something she did not recognize at first, because she had not seen it in So long concerned, the human crouched down slowly like it was trying not to frighten a wild animal, and it held up its hands to show they were empty, and it spoke in a voice that was deep but gentle, and her translator implant struggled to process the unfamiliar language, but after a moment, the words became clear. "Hey there, little one, can you hear me?" Kiravel tried to speak, but only a weak croak came out of her throat, and she shrank back against the wall, because every story she had ever heard about humans said they were dangerous and unpredictable, and that they came from a world of death where everything tried to kill everything else, and that they ate poison for pleasure and kept predators as companions. But the human did not attack her. Instead, it moved closer very slowly, and it reached up and pulled off its mask, and she saw a face that was weathered and scarred, with a jagged line running across the jaw and rough stubble on the cheeks and tired lines around the eyes. But there was no cruelty in that face, and there was no hunger, and there was only a strange soft expression that made her chest ache for reasons she could not explain. "You are hurt," the human said, and its voice was even gentler, now almost a whisper. "You are freezing to death, and I am not going to let that happen." Kiravel felt tears forming in her eyes, and they froze on her cheeks almost instantly, but she could not stop them because she had been so sure she was going to die, and she had been so sure no one would ever come, and she had been so sure that she would wander alone in the dark forever. The human reached out with one large hand, and it moved so slowly and so carefully, and she flinched when it touched her shoulder. But the touch was warm, even through the thick gloves, and the human leaned closer and spoke words that her translator rendered perfectly, but that her mind could not quite accept. "You are safe now." She wanted to ask why, and she wanted to ask how, and she wanted to ask what this creature could possibly want from her, because nothing in the galaxy was free, and kindness always came with a price. But she was too weak and too cold and too tired to form the questions. Human lifted her from the frozen floor like she weighed nothing at all and cradled her against its chest, and she could feel warmth radiating through its suit and into her frozen body, and it was the most wonderful thing she had ever felt in her entire life. "I have got you," the human said as it carried her out into the blinding white snow. "My ship is close, and we have heat and food and medicine, and you are going to be okay." Kiravel did not know if she believed those words, but she wanted to believe them more than she had ever wanted anything, and so she let herself sink into the warmth of this strange creature, and she let her eyes close, and she let the darkness take her. But this time, the darkness was not cold. This time, the darkness was warm. Kiravel woke to the sound of humming machines and the smell of recycled air, and for one terrible moment, she thought she was back on the slaver ship, and she sat up so fast that her head spun and her vision blurred, and she nearly fell off the narrow bed she had been lying on. Whoa, easy there. A voice came from somewhere to her left, and she turned and saw a young human, female with dark hair pulled back in a messy knot and bright, curious eyes that watched her with a mixture of concern and fascination. And the female held up her hands in the same gesture the male had used on the frozen moon. "You are safe," the female said. "You are on the Wayward Sun, and my name is Yuki, and I am the engineer, and you have been asleep for almost 2 full days, and Captain Cole has been checking on you every few hours because he was worried you might not wake up." Kiravel looked down at herself and saw that she was wrapped in thick thermal blankets, and there were small patches attached to her arms and chest that blinked with soft lights, and she could feel warmth flowing through her body like she was lying in a hot spring back home, and most importantly, she could see her glow returning beneath her skin. She was alive. She should not be alive, but she was. Where? She managed to croak, and her throat was so dry that the word came out like gravel scraping against stone. Yuki handed her a container with a long straw, and Kiravel drank greedily, and the water was cool and clean, and tasted better than anything she had ever tasted before. And when she was finished, she tried again. "Where am I, and why did you help me?" Yuki tilted her head, and her expression became confused, like the question did not make sense to her, and she opened her mouth to answer. But before she could speak, the door slid open, and the male from the frozen moon walked in. He looked different without his thermal gear, and Kiravel could see that he was older than she had first thought, with gray streaks in his dark hair and deep lines around his eyes, and the scar on his jaw was even more prominent in the soft amber light of the medical bay, but his eyes were still warm and still kind. "You are awake," he said, and his voice carried obvious relief. "I was starting to worry we found you too late." "Captain Cole," Yuki said. She was asking why we helped her. The captain stopped walking, and his brow furrowed, and he looked at Kiravel like she had just asked him why the stars were bright or why. Space was dark, and he seemed genuinely uncertain how to answer such a simple question. "Because you needed help," he said finally. "That is reason enough." Kiravel stared at him and waited for the rest of the explanation, and waited for him to tell her what she would have to do to repay this debt, and waited for him to reveal what he wanted from her, but he just stood there and looked at her with that same confused expression. "I do not understand," she said. Captain Cole pulled up a small chair and sat down beside her bed, and he leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees, and he spoke slowly like he was explaining something to a child, but not in a cruel way, and more in the way of someone who genuinely wanted to be understood. "My crew and I, as salvagers," he said, "we travel to places where ships have crashed or been abandoned, and we recover useful materials and equipment, and sometimes we find survivors. And when we do, we help them because that is what decent people do. But I am a stranger," Kiravel said. "I am not of your species, and I have nothing to offer you. I cannot pay you, and I do not understand why you would risk anything for someone you do not know." The captain smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face and made him look younger and softer and almost gentle. "Where I come from," he said, "that is exactly the kind of person you help." Over the next several days, Kiravel met the rest of the crew, and each of them confused her more than the last because none of them seemed to expect anything from her, and none of them treated her like a burden or a problem, and none of them asked what she could do for them in return. There was Dev, the pilot, who was tall and thin and could not seem to sit still for more than a few seconds at a time, and who made jokes constantly, even when no one laughed, and who brought her extra blankets without being asked because he noticed she still shivered sometimes. There was old Thomas the cook, who hummed while he prepared meals, and who made special food for her that was gentle on her recovering stomach, and who told her stories about Earth while she ate, and who seemed to find genuine joy in watching her enjoy his cooking. There was Ren, the Teos medic, who was quiet and serious, and who checked on her 3 times every day, and who explained everything he was doing before he did it, and who never touched her without permission, and who treated her glow as a sign of health and celebrated when it grew brighter. And there was Yuki, who visited her constantly and asked her endless questions about her people and her world and her culture, and who shared information about humans with equal enthusiasm, and who seemed genuinely excited to have a new friend. Karavel watched them interact with each other, and she saw something she had never seen before in any species she had encountered, because they teased each other constantly, but never with cruelty, and they argued loudly but never with real anger, and they touched each other casually and frequently, and they laughed at things that were not funny, and they cared about each other in ways that were so obvious it almost hurt to witness. They were a family, not by blood, not by species, and not by any obligation, but by choice and by love and by something Kiravel did not have a word for in her language, but that humans called loyalty. She asked Captain Cole about it one evening when he came to check on her, and he sat in his usual chair and thought about her question for a long time before answering. "Humans are pack animals," he said. "We need connection, and we need belonging, and we need to know that someone has our back when things go bad, and when we find people who fit with us, we hold on to them, and we protect them, and we never let them go. Even strangers? Kiravel asked. Even aliens, and even people who cannot help you. Especially them, the captain said. The universe is cold and dark and lonely, and we know that. Better than most species, because we spent thousands of years looking at the stars and wondering if anyone else was out there. And now that we have found other life, we cannot bear to see anyone suffer the way we suffered when we thought we were. Alone, Kiravel felt. Her glow pulsed brighter, and she felt something shift inside her chest, and she felt the first fragile threads of trust beginning to form, and she wanted to believe him. And she wanted to believe that such kindness could exist. Without a price, but she had been hurt too many times to accept it so easily. And then the alarm started, screaming Captain. Cole was on his feet in an instant, and his whole demeanor changed, and the gentle man who had been sitting beside her bed was gone, and in his place was someone hard and sharp and dangerous. "Stay here," he said, and his voice left no room for argument. "Dev, what have we got?" The pilot's voice crackled through the ship's speakers, and for the first time since she had known him, there was no humor in his tone. 3 Korvax slaver vessels just dropped out of hyperspace, and they are heading straight for us, and they are demanding we hand over the Volanthi. Kiravel felt her glow dim and her blood run cold, and she knew. They had come for her, and she knew these humans would die because of her, and she opened her mouth to tell them to give her up, because she was not worth their lives. But Captain Cole was already gone, and she could hear him shouting orders as he ran toward the bridge, and she could hear the crew responding, and she could hear the ship's engines roaring to life, and she realized with a shock that they were not going to surrender. They were going to fight for here, a stranger, an alien, someone they did not know, and someone who could not help them, and someone who had nothing to offer. And Kiravel did not understand these creatures at all. Kiravel ignored the captain's order to stay in the medical bay, because she needed to see what was happening, and she needed to understand what these strange creatures were going to do, and she needed to know if she should surrender herself before they all died for nothing. She made her way through the narrow corridors of the ship, and she held on to the walls for support because her legs were still weak and the ship was shaking from the engine power. And when she reached the bridge, she stopped in the doorway and stared at what she saw. The humans had transformed Captain Cole stood at the center of the bridge, and his posture was straight, and his voice was calm and steady, and he gave orders with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. And there was no fear in his eyes, and there was no hesitation in his movements. Dev sat at the pilot controls, and his fingers danced across the panels with impossible speed, and his earlier restlessness had become focused precision, and he flew the ship through the asteroid field that surrounded the moon like he was born to do nothing. Elsuke crouched beside an open panel in the floor, and her hands moved through the wires and circuits with practiced ease, and she was laughing, and actually laughing while she worked, and she called out status reports in a voice that bubbled with something that sounded almost like excitement. Told Thomas stood at the weapons console, and his gentle humming cook's hands now rested on firing controls, and his face showed no expression at all, except for a cold hard determination that made him look like a completely different person. Ren monitored multiple screens at once and called out enemy positions and damage reports, and his usual quiet demeanor had become something sharp and efficient, and he tracked every detail of the battle with mechanical precision. "Captain," Dev called out, "lead ship is hailing us again." "Put them through," Cole said. The main screen flickered, and a Korvax face appeared, and Kiravel flinched because she recognized the yellow eyes and the scaled skin and the rows of small, sharp teeth, and she remembered those faces laughing as they dragged her people away. "Human vessel," the Korvax commander said. "You have one final chance to surrender the Volanthi female, and we will let you leave with your lives, but if you refuse, then we will destroy your ship and take her from the wreckage, and I promise you her suffering will be legendary." "Captain." Cole smiled, and it was not the warm, gentle smile Kiravel had seen before, and it was something else entirely, and it showed teeth. "I have a counteroffer," he said. "You turn your ships around and leave this system and never come back, and I will let you live because I am feeling generous today." The Korvax commander laughed, and the sound was harsh and cruel and full of contempt. "You are one small salvage ship against 3 warships, and you cannot win this fight, human." "Maybe not," Cole said, and his smile grew wider. "But I promise you this, and I have never broken a promise in my life. And if you try to take that girl, then I will make you pay for every inch in blood and fire and pain, and when the smoke clears, your superiors will wonder why 3 ships and their crews disappeared chasing one worthless Velanthi refugee." He leaned forward, and his voice dropped to something cold and quiet. "And they will learn that she was under the protection of humans." The Korvax commander hesitated, and Kiravel saw something flicker in those yellow eyes, and she realized with shock that it was doubt, because even the slavers knew the stories about humans, and even they wondered if those stories might be true. But then the commander snarled and cut the transmission, and the 3 warships began their attack. What happened next would stay with Kiravel for the rest of her life. Threw the ship into a dive that should have been impossible, and they plunged into the asteroid field, and the Korvax ships followed, but they were bigger and slower, and they had to navigate carefully while the wayward sun danced between the tumbling rocks like water flowing through stones. "Yuki," Cole shouted, "tell me you have those modifications online." "Just finished," Yuki called back, and her voice was bright with triumph. "Relgan is hot and ready, Captain." "Relgan," Kiravel whispered, because she had not seen any weapons on this ship, and she had thought it was just a simple cargo vessel. Old Thomas heard her and glanced over his shoulder, and his eyes crinkled with something that might have been amusement. "Salvagers find all sorts of interesting things floating in space, little one." The lead Korvax ship fired, and green plasma bolts streaked past the view screen, and one of them clipped the hull, and the whole ship shuddered. But Dev was already spinning them away, and Thomas returned fire, and the hidden railgun spoke with a sound like thunder, and a streak of white light punched through the enemy shields and tore into their weapon systems. "Direct hit," Ren reported. "Their forward batteries are offline." "Good," Cole said. "Dev, get us behind that big asteroid at bearing 7-2, and then cut engines." Cutting engines in a firefight. "Captain," Dev said, but he was already following the order. "You really are crazy." They drifted behind the massive rock and went completely silent, and the Korvax ship swept past, searching for them, and Yuki launched something out of the cargo bay, and it tumbled away into space, broadcasting their engine signature like a decoy too of the Korvax ships to false signal, and the third came around the asteroid. Alone and Dev hit the engines at full power, and they shot forward like a missile. And they flew so close to the enemy ship that Kiravel could see the individual hull plates through the viewscreen. Thomas fired again and again, and the railgun tore through the sensor array and blinded the Korvax vessel. And then Dev did something impossible and flew through the gap he had created and came out the other side, while Yuki triggered something that made the enemy engine core overload. The Korvax ship exploded behind them. The other 2 ships realized they had been tricked and turned back, but now they were facing a human crew that had tasted victory, and humans who smelled blood became something terrible and wonderful and unstoppable. Cole commanded with fury in his voice, and Dev flew like a demon, and Thomas fired with deadly precision, and Yuki kept the ship running despite damage that should have crippled them, and Ren directed their attacks with cold efficiency, and together they were not 5 individuals, but one perfect machine of destruction. A plasma bolt caught them hard, and Cole was thrown from his feet, and blood sprayed from a gash on his forehead. But he was standing again before Kiravel could even scream, and he wiped the blood from his eyes and kept giving orders and kept fighting and refused to fall. The second Korvax ship tried to ram them, and Dev spun away at the last second, and Thomas put 3 railgun rounds through their bridge, and the ship went dark and began to drift. Final Korvac's vessel turned and ran. "Should I pursue, Captain?" Dev asked, and his voice was hungry for more. "No," Cole said, and he slumped against his console and breathed hard. "Let them go, and let them tell the others what happened here." The bridge fell silent, except for the sounds of damaged systems sparking, and crew members breathing, and somewhere in the ship, an alarm was still wailing, but no one moved to silence it. Yuki let out a whoop of triumph and pumped her fist in the air, and Dev spun in his chair and high-fived old Thomas and even ran aloud. Himself, a small smile caravel, stood in the doorway and stared at these creatures who had just risked everything for her, and she felt her glow blazing brighter than it had since the attack on her ship, and she felt tears streaming down her face. And she did not know if they were from fear or relief or gratitude or something else entirely. Captain Cole looked up and saw her, and his bloody face softened, and he limped toward her and put one heavy hand on her shoulder. "I told you to stay in." "Medical," he said, but there was no anger in his voice. "Why?" she asked, and the word came out as a sob. "Why did you do that? And why did you risk everything? And why did any of you fight for me?" Cole looked at her with those warm brown eyes, and he seemed genuinely puzzled by the question, like he could not understand why she kept asking it. "Because you were scared and alone," he said simply. "And that is not something we walk away from, and not ever, and not for any reason." Caravel threw herself against him and wrapped her arms around him and held on as tightly as she could, and she did not care that he was covered in blood. And she did not care that she was crying, and she only cared that these impossible creatures had chosen to protect her when no one else in the galaxy would have bothered. And Cole held her and let her cry and said nothing, because sometimes words were not needed behind them. The crew began repairs, and somewhere old Thomas started humming again, and somewhere Yuki was laughing about the damage to her engines, and somewhere Dev was replaying the battle footage with obvious pride, and Caravel finally began to understand what it meant to be protected by humans. 6 months had passed since the day Caravel chose to stay, and in that time she had changed in ways she never could have imagined. Her glow no longer dimmed when she was stressed or afraid, because she had learned that she was never truly alone anymore, and her light burned steady and bright like a small star carried inside her chest, and the crew had started calling her their lucky charm, because good things seemed to happen when she was around. She had learned to play cards with Dev, and she was almost as good as old Thomas now, and she had learned to help Yuki with repairs, even though her small hands were not made for human tools, and she had learned to cook 3 different Earth dishes that made the crew cheer when she served them, and she had learned to sit with Ren in comfortable silence and just exist together without needing to fill the space with words. She had learned what it meant to be part of a family. The Wayward Sun had continued its work as a salvage vessel. But something had changed in the months since the battle with the Korvacs, and word had spread through the space lanes about the human crew that had fought 3 warships for a single Volanti refugee, and other Volanti had started seeking out human ships and human stations and human colonies, because if one human crew would do that for a stranger, then maybe all humans were like that, and maybe the stories about Deathworlders were wrong. Captain Cole had framed the bounty notice the Korvac Syndicate had put on their heads and hung it on the wall of the galley like a trophy, and he pointed to it whenever someone asked about their reputation, and said that he had never been so proud of anything in his life. Caravel had become something she never expected to become. She had become a symbol. Other Volanti contacted her through communication relays and asked if the stories were true. I asked if humans really would protect strangers. I asked if it was safe to trust these strange creatures from the death world called Earth. And Caravel told them the truth. She told them that humans were everything the story said and more. She told them that humans were dangerous and unpredictable and fierce beyond measure. but that they used that danger to protect the weak and the lost and the forgotten. She told them that humans remembered what it was like to be alone, and that they had decided to make sure no one else ever had to feel that way. She told them that she had found a family among the stars and that they could find one too if they were brave enough to try. The distress call came on a cold morning when Caravel was eating breakfast with old Thomas and teaching him a Volante song that he was determined to learn, even though human vocal cords were not designed for the high trilling notes. Captain Cole's voice crackled through the ship's speakers, and there was something urgent in his tone. "All hands to the bridge, we have got a situation." They gathered quickly, and Cole brought up the sensor display, and Caravel saw a familiar sight that made her chest tighten with memory. A frozen moon at the edge of a debris field, and the wreckage of a small ship half buried in ice and snow, and a faint life sign coming from inside the broken hull. "The signal is weak," Wren reported. "Whoever is down there does not have much time." "Then we move fast," Cole said. "Caravel, you are with me." She looked at him in surprise, because she had never been on a rescue mission before, and she had always stayed on the ship while the others did the dangerous work. But Cole just smiled and handed her a thermal suit. "You know what it feels like to be down there," he said. "You know what they need to hear." The shuttle ride down to the surface was short and bumpy, and Caravel's heart pounded in her chest the whole way, but she was not afraid because she had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act. Anyway, they landed near the wreckage, and the cold hit her like a physical blow, even through the thermal suit, and she remembered that feeling, and she remembered lying in the cargo hold and waiting to die, and she remembered thinking that no one would ever come, but someone had come for her, and now she would be that someone for another lost soul. Cole led the way through the snow, and they found the breach in the hull, and they climbed inside, and the interior was dark and frozen and silent except for the howling, whine, and then Caravel heard a soft sound like breathing or crying or both, and it came from a corner of the cargo hold, and she moved toward it while Cole hung back and watched. She found the survivor huddled behind a stack of frozen crates, and she stopped and stared, because this was not what she had expected. It was a Carvinsa, young one barely more than a child, with scales that had not fully hardened and yellow eyes that were wide with terror and a body that shook with cold and fear and exhaustion. The Korvax saw her and flinched and tried to crawl away, and words tumbled out of its mouth in a desperate stream. "Please do not hurt me, and please do not take me back." And I could not do it anymore, and I could not watch them hurt people anymore, and I ran away, and I stole a ship, and it crashed, and please just let me die here because it is better than going back. Caravel felt something shift inside her chest. She remembered the Korvax who had grabbed her arm and laughed and thrown her away like garbage, and she remembered the faces of the slavers who had taken her people, and she remembered the fear and the pain and the hatred that had burned in her heart for months after. But she also remembered a human who had found her in the cold, and who had whispered words that saved her life, and who had shown her that kindness was stronger than cruelty, and that compassion was more powerful than hate. She knelt down slowly, and she held up her hands to show they were empty, and she spoke in a voice that was gentle and soft. "I am not going to hurt you." The Korvax stared at her, and confusion flickered across its young face. "But I am Korvax," it said, "and my people hurt your people, and you should hate me." "Maybe I should," Caravel said, "but I do not, because someone taught me that we do not have to be defined by what others of our kind have done, and we can choose to be different, and we can choose to be better." She reached out slowly, and the Korvax flinched but did not pull away, and she put her hand on its shoulder and felt how cold it was and how thin and how tired. "Hey," she said, and she smiled, and her glow pulsed warm and bright. "It is okay, and you are safe now." The Korvax burst into tears behind her captain. Cole stepped forward, and his face was soft with something like pride, and he knelt down beside her and wrapped a thermal blanket around the shivering young creature. "Let us get you somewhere warm," he said, "and then you can tell us your story, and we can figure out what comes next together." They carried the young Korvax back to the shuttle, and then back to the ship, and Ren took over medical care while the others watched, and Yuki made warm drinks, and Dev told bad jokes to lighten the mood, and old Thomas started humming one of his Earth songs. Garovel stood in the doorway of the medical bay and watched the crew work, and she felt her glow burning brighter than it ever had before, because she understood now what the humans had tried to teach her all along. Kindness was not weakness, and compassion was not foolishness, and choosing to help others was not a burden but a gift. The gift the humans had given her was not just her life. It was the understanding that she could be the warmth in the cold and the light in the darkness, and the voice that whispered words of hope to the lost and the broken and the afraid. She could be what Marcus Cole had been for her. That was worth more than anything else in the galaxy. That night, after the young Korvax was stable and sleeping, and after the crew had eaten dinner together and laughed about old stories and teased each other about old mistakes and argued about whose turn it was to clean the dishes, Kiravel found Captain Cole on the observation deck staring out at the stars. She stood beside him, and they watched the universe spin past in silence for a long time. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what?" he asked. "For teaching me what it means to be human." Cole laughed, and the sound was warm and full of joy. "You are not human," he said. "No," Caravel agreed. "But I carry a piece of humanity inside me now, and I will carry it forever, and I will pass it on to everyone I meet until the whole galaxy knows what humans really are." Cole put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close, and they stood together and watched the stars wheel past, and somewhere out there in the endless dark, another lost soul was waiting to be found. And thanks to the humans, and thanks to a small Volante who had learned to glow again, that soul would not have to wait alone, because kindness once given could never truly be lost. It could only grow and spread and multiply until even the coldest corners of the universe felt its warmth, and that was the gift humanity gave to the galaxy. Not conquest, and not fear, and not the reputation of Deathworlders, but light, endless, beautiful, unbreakable light in the darkness between the stars. The Valkyrie were not a species that believed in mercy or second chances or the kind of hope that made other races weak in their eyes. They were ancient beings who had conquered star systems before humans had learned to make fire, and they ruled their empire through cold logic and absolute obedience to the prophecies that their seers spoke. When a seer spoke, the Valkyrie listened, and when a seer said that death was coming, they prepared for war. But this prophecy was different from all the others that had come before. The High Seer had looked into the streams of time and space, and she had seen something that made her ancient heart fill with terror. A child would be born under the dying light of the Ashimol Nebula, and this child would bring ruin to everything the Valkyrie had built over 10,000 years. The empire would crumble, and their people would scatter like dust in the void of space, and nothing would remain of their glory. The Valkyrie High Council did not debate, or argue, or waste time with questions. They simply gave the order. When the child was born to a minor noble family, her fate was already sealed before she took her first breath. The infant came into the world with skin that shimmered like moonlight on water, and her flesh was almost see-through, with patterns of soft light that moved beneath her surface like living things. Her eyes opened, and they were the color of broken purple crystals, and the nurses who attended the birth stepped back in fear, because they had never seen markings like these. The marks of the Cursed One the prophecy had warned about. Her mother was not allowed to hold her, and her father was not allowed to speak her name, and within hours of her birth, the child was taken from the birthing chamber and placed into a small stasis pod designed for long-distance travel. The Valkyrie could have killed her right there and ended the threat before it could grow, but they were a superstitious people despite their advanced technology. Killing a cursed child might release the curse upon them all they believed. Better to send her far away to some forgotten corner of the galaxy, where she would die slowly and the curse would die with her. They searched their star maps for the most primitive and isolated world they could find, and their sensors eventually landed on a small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system. The natives called it Earth. The Valkyrie laughed at the readings they received from this world, because the creatures there still burned dead plants for energy, and they had not even managed to leave their own tiny moon more than a handful of times. Surely, any child sent there would perish within days, and even if she survived, she would grow up among savages who could never help her understand what she truly was. The pod was launched without ceremony or prayer, and the Valkyrie erased all records of the child's existence from their databases. As far as their empire was concerned, she had never been born at all. The pod traveled through space for months, moving faster than light, through channels that human scientists had not yet discovered, and when it finally reached Earth, it entered the atmosphere like a falling star. It crashed in the northern wilderness of a country that humans called Canada, far from their cities and roads, and far from anyone who might report what had fallen from the sky. But it was not far from everyone. Marcus Cole had lived alone in his cabin for 3 years, ever since the fire that had taken everything from him. His wife, Sarah, had died in her sleep when the flames reached their bedroom, and his daughter, Emma, had been trapped in her room on the second floor, and Marcus had tried so hard to reach her, but the ceiling had collapsed, and he had been pulled out by firefighters while his little girl's screams echoed in his ears. He had been a search and rescue specialist for 20 years before that night, and he had saved hundreds of lives, but he could not save the two people who mattered most. After the funerals, he had sold everything and bought this cabin in the middle of nowhere because he did not want to be around people anymore. He wanted to disappear into the trees and the snow and the silence until the world forgot about him, and he forgot about the world. That night, Marcus was sitting on his porch watching the stars when he saw the light streaking across the sky, and he knew immediately that it was not a meteor or a plane. He had seen enough falling objects in his rescue career to recognize when something was wrong. He grabbed his flashlight and his first aid kit out of habit, and he hiked through the dark forest for almost an hour, following the direction where the light had fallen. When he found the crash site, his flashlight revealed a small crater in the frozen ground, and at the center of the crater sat something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a pod made of metal that seemed to glow with an inner light, and the surface was covered in symbols that Marcus had never seen before in any language on Earth. He approached slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, and when he got close enough to touch the pod, it suddenly opened. With a soft hiss, inside, wrapped in some kind of silver cloth, was a baby. Her skin was pale and almost translucent, and beneath the surface, Marcus could see soft patterns of light moving like gentle waves, and her tiny hands had only 3 fingers. Each, in her eyes, when they opened, were purple like amethysts that had been cracked and put back together. She did not cry like a human baby would. She simply looked up at Marcus with those strange, beautiful eyes, and she watched him as if she was trying to understand what kind of creature he was. Marcus stood there in the cold for a long time, just staring back at her. He knew he should call someone, because this was clearly something beyond his understanding, and there were people with the government and scientists and experts who would know what to do. But then the baby reached up with one of her small 3-fingered hands, and she wrapped her fingers around his thumb, and something that had been dead inside Marcus for 3 years suddenly came alive again. He thought of Emma and how she used to grab his finger the same way when she was small, and how she would smile up at him like he was the whole world. This child was not Emma, and she was not even human, but she was alone and abandoned and afraid, just like Marcus had felt every night since the fire. He made his choice in that moment. He lifted the baby carefully from the pod and wrapped her in his jacket, and he held her close to his chest to keep her warm in the foul freezing night. She did not make a sound, but her small body relaxed against him like she somehow knew that she was safe. Marcus carried her back through the forest to his cabin, and he laid her in a basket near the fireplace, and he sat watching her until the sun came up, when she woke again and looked at him with those purple eyes. He knew what he was going to do. He would raise her as his own, and he would protect her from whatever had abandoned her, and he would give her the love that she deserved. He named her Lily because there were wild lily that grew near the cabin every spring, and they were beautiful and unexpected, just like she was. And so began the story of how a broken man found hope in the most unlikely place, and how an abandoned alien child found something that her own people had never given her: a father.